Okay, we're going to start here with going over some of the basic concepts and to set up a lens to go through the course. So I'm going to begin by talking about consumption technology in everyday life and how to think about that. Essentially, that's the name of the course, so we need to start there. So, from a sociological perspective, everyday life is a way of thinking about um, the way that people are living and the way that we're connected to wider institutions and structures and how that feels and what it means for, humans to be a human. So it's the mundane kind of practices that we're doing all the time. But what we try and do is kind of go beyond taken for granted assumptions, and do that kind of classic sociological thing of making the normal look strange. So in a course like this, where we're largely focused on digital technologies, many of which have become kind of infrastructural in our day-to-day lives, we rely on them so much for almost everything. What this course will do from a kind of quite critical sociological perspective is try to reposition and repurpose your orientation towards them to think a little bit more critically about them. So we'll be doing that through a bunch of concepts, and we'll be doing that through a bunch of looking at a bunch of different empirical research projects and things like that, and kind of uncovering the various dialogues, decisions, feelings, structures, markets, institutions, histories, emotions, ethics, values, and morals that are kind of circulating around the kind of what I'm calling in the course the algorithmic and AI assemblage. Much of the way we kind of think about things like consumption and technology and think about things and digital things in particular is often through, binaries, whether they're good or bad, whether they kind of about our wants and needs, whether, they are kind of global or local actors, the ways that they're kind of set up between public and private. In particular, when it comes to the environmental aspects, the kind of the false dichotomy between nature and culture. When it comes to kind of thinking about what these technologies are doing and how we engage with them, whether we're savvy and kind of using them for our own purposes or whether we're suckers and kind of being tricked to, behave in certain ways and, give up our data and buying more stuff. In particular, there's been this thing between the real and the digital, and we'll kind of critically engage with that paradox all the way through as well. So we'll kind of think through these dichotomies, these kind of pairs, but we'll kind of try and move beyond them, pointing out how there's kind of multiple paradoxes involved in the way that these things interrelate. So in the sociological understanding, what's going on here, the notion of consumption moves beyond just kind of like eating and drinking. If you're listening to a song or reading a book or you're buying a car or, having a coffee, these kind of things that are part of your lifestyle and every day are forms of consumption. And there's been lots of like over and under consumption kind of stresses. There's the way that consumption relates to our self-identity and our social identities. So here we're thinking about consumption in terms of various practices. If you're on Facebook and or TikTok and you're scrolling through, you're consuming that content. So consumption here is a kind of very broad term to think about many of the different things we do in day-to-day life. Sociology was seen to go through a bit of a turn from kind of focusing on production, modes of production, labor, what we do in our work life, moving towards thinking about how we think about ourselves, our self-identity and the way that we relate to others, social identity through modes of consumption, through what people like and what people think and do in terms of their kind of more creative and leisure practices and cultural sides. So again, we're looking at that in this course, but looking at the way these things are now increasingly disseminated and performed and done on various digital platforms and the kind of interface, what that means, the interface with like the way algorithms and other things that are kind of not really in our control, what this means to the kind of different forms of consumption we do, the different ways we're kind of nudged towards being particular kinds of people, and, whether or not we're, maybe more or less in control of these kind of things. Technology has also been a really key object of study in sociology. There's a kind of the technological determinist side of things that kind of sketch out that like whatever technology is, that's what society is. And then there's kind of a further step to that often like technology determines what we do. Others kind of see technology much more as kind of tools for everyday life. It's not necessarily dominating us. We can kind of use them in some ways and kind of rebel and resist them and be creative with them in other ways. But certainly technologies do come to represent, that really and be key to the dominant ways of life. Things like the invention of the car, for instance, fundamentally changed how cities operate. In fact, whole global cities have been kind of largely designed around the use of the car, and that's increasingly a trap. It's very difficult now to kind of, design a more kind of public transport kind of city. The car's very individualistic. We have kind of climate change implications because of that. We're kind of stuck on a path dependency there when it comes to the use of the car. So the use of the car has all these kinds of, and the invention of the car and the saturation of the use of the car has all these kind of knock-on effects in terms of things like urban design and ways of life. So we need to think about all technologies in a way of that kind of thing. Um, there's like, you know, television changes the way that we kind of view the world, and we kind of have all these images now that maybe we didn't get to engage with in the past. The rise of social media becomes a more two-way forms of technology where people engage with each other and create their own content. Again, these things have profound implications on the way that we live and what we think of ourselves and how we relate to others. So technologies transform everyday life, but they also become quite mundane. They're kind of part of everyday life, and after the kind of often sometimes novel or um, kind of fun or kind of scary introductions of them, they just become normal parts of everyday life. The mobile phone being a very key example of that. What starts as a kind of thing to be able to kind of talk to people in the street or whatever in the 90s, and you can kind of don't have to be, stuck at home in your lounge room attached to the wall to talk to other people, develops over the time to now we have these tools that you can do almost anything on them. Um, all kinds of affordances there in terms of what we can and can't do. You can listen to music, you can, track your food, you can do all kinds of stuff. But on the other side of things, we're seeing this the rise of the phone as a kind of increasing way to track us, to get our data, to kind of impel us to behave in certain ways as well. So here we can see this kind of difference between the risks and affordances, agency where we can kind of do stuff with it, and there's more kind of surveillance, control, and structures going on around them as well. So technology is essentially a human fabrication, something that um, there are kind of limits to the ways that kind of that we can control these things. Sometimes technologies are invented and we lose control of them, or they become used for other things. The internet being a good example, it was kind of largely developed for defense and military purposes, and now it's become kind of essential to everyday life. Um, so more broadly, technology is this kind of artificial means to produce kind of and go beyond natural kind of power. Um, So technology in this sense, the way we use it in this course is very broad. You know, reading glasses is a form of technology. It's a kind of thing to accentuate, people's vision. But mostly what we're looking at in the course is digital stuff, digital platforms, algorithms, and AI. These are the key technologies we're going to be looking at throughout the course. Um, So we also there's two parts to this kind of notion. There's instrumentality, attempts to control human environments, and then the more productive stuff, the way the technologies can bring new things into existence. And again, we'll be looking at a plethora of examples of those throughout the course. Really importantly in this course, we'll be thinking about how inequality is important to the kind of notions of consumption and technology and the ways that things like algorithms and AI come to affect us, come to be part of our lives, the ways, who benefits from the development of these things. And certainly there's a huge unevenness in this kind of stuff. Technologies are always experienced in context, in time and place. And particularly technologies has tend to have been attached to kind of stories of development and progress. And we need to be very careful of these kind of linear trajectories and kind of, almost mythical stories about how these things work. We can see this in terms of the unevenness in the globe, where in the kind of more rich, what we call the West, or sometimes in inverted commas, the developed world, or again, in inverted commas, the first world. What I'll mostly refer to in this course is the minority world, because those kind of things, in terms of their hierarchies, are actually the kind of less amount of people, tend to have more access to these things. They reach saturation in terms of more people having them and becoming completely normal over time, compared to, say, what we would call the majority world, which is sometimes referred to as the third world or the developing world. Um, and there tends to be kind of less access to those kind of things. Also, there's huge kind of differences in kind of where things are made and where things are used. In saying that, that's a kind of traditional kind of power structure there. What seems to have happened with kind of most recent technologies is they often seem to jump forms of technology. In the African continent, for instance, many countries there kind of never really developed landlines for phones, but like so there isn't some kind of development between no phone having a landline and then to the mobile that kind of happened in the West. When the mobile comes along, it kind of skips the landline and goes straight to the mobile, and this has kind of very clear and different implications to what that technology does in those societies, how people use it, and what it means for them. So throughout the course, we'll be thinking about how technologies are uneven, they're contextual of their time and place, um, and how they can kind of enhance qualities and sometimes exacerbate inequalities. What technologies also do sometimes is start to create new inequalities. With the rise of AI and the rise of kind of algorithmic technologies and the dominance of them in our day-to-day life, there's kind of increasing public discourse that like, AI might kind of wipe out humans and we should be afraid of this kind of stuff. What's interesting about that kind of version of technophobia is that in the past, most of the fears of new technologies came from lay people, the general population, not the experts that produced them or made them or knew a lot about them. That kind of technophobia tended to come from people that didn't really understand the implications of the new technologies. And often the people that did kind of had to justify them through politics or advertising and these kind of things. What we have in today's situation is many of the people in the tech industry are the ones talking about how AI, for instance, is going to end the world. Contemporary technophobia, as pointed out by Cal Newport, seems to come a lot from insiders and those that are adopting it and actually forcing it down our throats. So you hear kind of the bosses of AI companies like, at least performing versions of concern about this kind of stuff. As we'll look throughout the course, there seems to be a kind of key politics of this. By making stuff like AI and algorithmic machines seem so dominant and omnipresent, could be a way of kind of, again, just making us, the general population, feel like they're kind of inevitable and there's nothing we can do about it. Again, this is a real key politics here that we'll be kind of touching upon through almost every part of the course. The way technologies are produced, who gets to decide, where they're sold and how they're used. I mean, increasingly in something like AI, the way they've come to completely dominate um, global economies to the point now where, at the time of talking here, there's a huge bubble that has kind of, if it was to bust, would have all kinds of implications for the total economy and could very much look like the kind of economic crises, in 2008 when the housing bubble broke in the US. So should we be afraid of the technology? Maybe. I'm not saying that those kind of stories of AI, some kind of Terminator way will take over the world or something could happen. Seems very unlikely because, frankly, the way that most of the kind of AI capabilities seem to be rolling out is they're pretty clunky and don't do half of the things they claim to do. But maybe we should be more afraid of the power of the industries and what they actually can do. The idea they can just kind of break stuff and force things on us without our kind of permission or without our consent. It's these aspects that we'll be looking at, I think, more so in the course than the idea that somehow there's going to be some kind of Terminator dystopic kind of future. So an example of that kind of stuff that we're all exposed to, and I think that draws out some of the fears that we have about technology and digital stuff in particular, is the deep fake. The rise of the deep fake, the ease of ability to kind of produce these things now, kind of fundamentally challenges our understanding of truth and true and false, and real and unreal. And increasingly, these things are being used politically to create kind of false images, to back up false claims about people or events, or even to create whole events that didn't really happen, or to distort a reality. So what's interesting about this is the kind of the blurriness here between like creativity, between like entertainment, between reality and the news and politics, all becomes in this kind of very blurry arena of like how it's increasingly difficult sometimes to tell the difference between, the real and the fake. So I think in some ways the notion of the deep fake really does kind of draw on perhaps, some of our deepest fears that we're kind of going to be able to, some way lose the ability to distinguish between humans and non-humans, and that speaks into some of those kind of more apocalyptic discourses. And I think this is a really good example of the everydayness of what I'm talking about in this course. The deep fake is every day, looking at photos is every day, and being able to kind of analyze, you know, how these things are produced or how people actually engage with these things and how they kind of feel gives us kind of key insight to how, digital technologies and, digital societies are experienced and lived in everyday life. So, um, there's a politics of the way that these things are produced, and there's a gender politics and racial politics and an inequality in terms of economic power and stuff like that that we can look at in all these kind of different examples to bring out some of the sociological imaginaries that's vital to kind of think about how we can improve things and actually have things work for humans rather than just companies and billionaires. So, do machines control us? We're not really interested in kind of situating that, giving a kind of answer to that question. And there's no really correct answer to that, really. In some respects, they may, in some respects, they may not. In some contexts and times, technologies may have more control over humans than others, or individuals, or groups, or whatever. What we want in this course is for you to develop a critical mindset towards, our current kind of algorithmic AI dominated society in terms of consumption and technology. So entanglement is a kind of good concept to think of that. Humans are certainly entangled with technologies every day. There's a radical unevenness to how people engage with or are engaged by these machines. But the kind of string puppet, like idea that all humans are kind of like puppets on a string, I think is also a massively oversimplistic way of thinking about what's happening here. And throughout the course, we'll see different creative uses of these things, some resistances and resilience against like the kind of overt dominance of what some of these technologies are trying to get us to do. So there's unevenness. Our engagement is dependent on a range of factors: place, race, class, gender, um, different legal structures around the world, whether you're a citizen or not. All these kind of things are really important. We'll be thinking through kind of notions of dependency, entrapment, control, progress, power, but also creativity and resistance and things like that. Increasingly, ownership and consent are important when it comes to these technologies, where companies are kind of just seem to be stealing people's creative work to kind of feed into these machines, and we can ask real questions about the kind of what this means for the very definition of culture, for instance, which we'll be looking at the course. Okay, I'm going to stop this part here and come back and talk about the way that I'm going to set up the notion of the algorithmic AR data assemblage in terms of what we're looking at throughout the rest of the course.